Hey there, U.S. historians. So today we're going to shift our focus. We're looking at the struggle of a lot of different groups throughout history. We're going to shift our focus to the struggle of African Americans. And when you're talking about the struggle of African Americans throughout history, you have to talk about the topic of slavery. Okay, so slavery has existed throughout world history. We're going to focus specifically on slavery in the United States. So one of the main kind of causes of the ramping up and entrenchment of slavery in the United States is the growth of cash crops such as tobacco and cotton. Okay, so I want to show you a visual of the transatlantic slave trade. Okay, so this map, once I can get this going here. Okay, each of you'll see kind of some dots come across the screen. Those are slave ships. Okay, so you should have learned in world history about the transatlantic slave trade. The whole entire system is referred to as the triangular trade. This visual is just showing you, here I'll maximize this a little bit larger for you, just the Middle Passage portion of it, where slaves are being kidnapped in Africa. Okay, these people are then enslaved and put on slave ships and shipped over to the Americas. So in the 1600s, you're going to see this is the era of European colonization. So a lot of these ships are going primarily to South America. They are being used to work in the gold and silver mines. You also see them going to the Caribbean islands. That's where you're going to see the growth of sugar plantations. And as it really amps up here in the 1600s and 1700s, you can see the reason why is South American slavery is very different. This whole system is awful, but the conditions in the Caribbean and South America, they're basically working these people to death and then simply replacing them. Okay. By the 1700s, this is where you start to see more ships going to what will become the United States. Okay, at this point, the cash crop is primarily tobacco. Okay, now with all of these, okay, it's really easy to just oversimplify and to get overwhelmed by the sheer number of dots, right? But each dot represents a ship packed with people. Okay, the conditions on these ships, this trip known as the Middle Passage, were atrocious. Okay, people were packed into super tight quarters. They were chained together. They were beaten and whipped to keep them in line. Okay, and it's estimated anywhere from 10 to 12 million Africans were taken over on the Middle Passage, kidnapped from Africa and brought to the Americas. Okay. Now, as we start kind of getting closer to the 1770s, okay, so 1776 is when the United States is going to declare its independence. Okay, by 1783, the American Revolution is completed with the Treaty of Paris. Okay, this is really around the time you start to see a split. Okay, slavery was legal in both the North and the South up to this point, but around the 1780s, with the Northwest Ordinance, you're going to start to see slavery start to kind of slowly be abolished in the northern states and become more entrenched in the South. Okay, by the 1800s, this is when you're going to see the South transition to the cash crop of cotton. Okay, the cotton gin is an invention that pulls the seeds out of the cotton ball, okay, which before had to be done by hand, which was very meticulous work. Because now a machine does that, they can now produce more cotton, but they need individuals, people, to pick it. Okay, so you're going to need a higher demand for slaves. Now, around 1808, you're going to see an interesting shift here. Okay, all the slave ships now are no longer going to the United States because the international slave trade has been abolished. That doesn't mean that the international slave trade is still continuing on in South America and the Caribbean, but as far as the United States, it is illegal. Now, that doesn't mean that slavery in the United States goes away by any means. Okay, they have to find another way of replenishing their slave population. And this is where American slavery is very different than slavery throughout history. Okay, prior to this, slave populations were only sustainable by acquiring more slaves through warfare. Okay, in the United States now they can't do that because they've banned the international slave trade. So they're going to encourage Southern plantation owners will encourage slaves to have families, to essentially breed is the language they're using, okay, to have kids, to increase the slave population. Okay, this ends in 1860 because they're gonna because of the Civil War, okay, the American Civil War. Now, with all of this, right, the main motivator, I'd argue, that pushes this whole awful system in place is greed, right? This desire for profit, to have super cheap labor, okay, to grow these cash crops. Now, why Africans? Well, as you learned in World Studies, you should have watched the documentary or read excerpts from Guns, Germs, and Steel. Okay, they tried enslaving Native Americans, but they're dying from disease. Africans are immune from these diseases, and they're less likely to run away because they've been taken across the globe. They're not familiar with the terrain. Okay, now this is something that students or historians struggle with and grapple with. Is the system is clearly awful, okay, but it still persists for 250 years. So how does this happen, right? So Southerners have to find a way to justify this institution that I think we all know is terrible. Okay, so one of the first arguments they'll use is the economic argument, that most of their wealth is invested in buying slaves. Slaves in the Americas in the United States are expensive. Okay, so if they were to shift towards now paying those workers, the entire economy of the South, which is dependent on slave labor, would collapse. Okay, another argument that Southerners are using is this fear of violent revenge. Okay, the system does not function without violence. Okay, in order to motivate these people to do this awful work, slave owners are going to use beatings, whippings, rape, okay, awful violence to try and get these people to work as hard as possible. Okay, so slave owners are fearful of giving them freedom because they're worried these free people will then seek violent revenge against them. Okay, another argument that Southerners use is that by comparison, Northern industrial workers have it worse. Okay, as slaves, they have their food provided for them, their housing provided for them, they have a guaranteed job, they have security. Okay, now this argument is kind of silly because if you think about Northern factory workers, they definitely don't have it great. Okay, but if they don't like their job, they can quit and leave. They have something more important, which is called freedom. Okay, which slaves do not have. Another argument that's made, this is the Bible Belt, the South, is using the Bible to justify the system. They're going to say that the Bible doesn't explicitly denounce slavery, that slavery is very evident in the Bible, which it is, especially in the Old Testament. What they kind of cleverly forget is that slavery was very prevalent in the Bible because it was prevalent during society at that time that it was written. Okay, they forget probably one of the most important prophets that goes against this, which is Moses. Moses was a slave that freed the Jews out of slavery in Egypt. Okay, and is seen as kind of a hero of these tales. And the last argument they're going to try and use science to justify this. They're going to try and prove that Africans are inherently inferior. Okay, the word I have here, this is important, it's pseudoscience. This science has since been disproven. I think I've mentioned before, race is a human invention. Okay, I'm not saying that we don't have differences. Of course we do. Okay, we have different hair textures, different eye colors, different skin tone. Okay, but how we classify people, that's something that humans have done. There's no genetic marker in your DNA for race because it's something that humans and sociologists created. Okay, so kind of the last component here is it's important to note that not everyone's on board with slavery. Okay, at the same time, it's an oversimplification to just say that all the North is opposed and all the South is in favor. Okay, I know that's essentially the Civil War will become North versus South, but it's not so simple. Okay, many Northerners, they may not be in favor of slavery, but that's because they don't want to compete against slave labor. Okay, a lot of them are not in favor of full equality for African Americans. But you will have this group, this is a key term that I'd certainly write down, abolitionists. Okay, so there's kind of a word in there, abolish. They want to abolish the institution of slavery. Okay, some of the most famous abolitionists you might be familiar with, you may have learned about in middle school or elementary school. One pictured here on the upper left is Frederick Douglass. Okay, so Frederick Douglass, he escaped slavery, okay, gets an education, and writes a series of books that talk about his awful experiences in slavery. Okay, because oftentimes people in the North are not thinking about where their products come from. They're not thinking about the awful conditions of slaves because they don't see it firsthand. But when they read it, they kind of garner some sympathy towards this. Okay, as history progresses during the Civil War, Frederick Douglass, he's going to emerge as a prominent abolitionist. He's going to become advisor to the president Abraham Lincoln, okay, about issues of slavery and push for him to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, another person is Harriet Tubman, pictured right here. Most students are usually fairly familiar with her. Okay, you'll be reading in much more detail about each of these individuals. Okay, and kind of the last note here, women are going to become some of the most prominent abolitionists. Okay, one of the reasons why is because they see a lot of similarities in their conditions. Okay, they don't have free speech. Okay, if they speak out, men don't necessarily want to hear it. Okay, they can't own property. They're discouraged from having any economic opportunities because they're kind of confined to the home. Okay, they're often victims of violence and can't do anything about it. I'm talking about domestic violence. Okay, the law oftentimes would not intervene in domestic violence because that was seen as an issue between the family. Okay, so they share a lot of kind of sympathy towards this cause, and that's something you're going to read more specifically about as you read about different abolitionists. Okay, so that's it for right now. We'll continue and look at the Civil War and what comes after a little bit later. So that's it for right now. Have a great day, my U.S. historians. Thanks. Bye.